Welcome to the Dreamit Dose. Revenue is an extremely overloaded word. B2B SaaS startup founders in particular tend to use the term in a very generic manner when pitching investors, thinking the number they are stating is clearly understood. But B2B SaaS revenue is rarely implicit. So in this dose, we'll give you 5 ways to clearly and accurately characterize your B2B SaaS revenue to investors. Let's jump in.
Dreamit Ventures has been investing in great early-stage startups for over a decade. The Dreamit Dose allows us to share best practices to help even more founders. Tell us about your great startup using the links below.
Let's talk about your actual annual recurring revenue, or ARR. When a B2B SaaS founder says revenue, investors assume this is ARR, which carries its own baked-in notions. ARR often implies a signed contract with an enterprise customer that is subscription-based or recurring over a certain time period. To an investor, B2B SaaS ARR means predictable revenue with generally high margins that ideally improve its scale, assuming your customers don't churn. This type of cash flow is incredibly attractive to an enterprise SaaS investor who is trying to determine your startup's current and future value. But often, we'll hear founders highlight revenue and throw in things that complicate the math and muddle a clean assessment. If it's not revenue that recurs annually, it's not ARR and it's out. So here's how to avoid that. Number 1, segment one-off from recurring revenue. If portions of your revenue are tied to things like implementation, hardware sales, or consulting, they likely won't get enterprise software investors as excited, and you need to separate and segment them out. In a B2B SaaS model, one-off revenue like this is usually lower margin and not as attractive when investors determine the repeatability of your future cash flow. Because of this, B2B SaaS investors don't give one-off revenue tied to consulting, hardware sales, or implementation a lot of credit, and it's common for them to discount it when setting your valuation. In practice, peeling back this layer for investors will shift your conflated revenue statement from a broad $1 million in revenue last year to something more refined and clearly characterized like $400K in ARR and $600K in one-off implementation, hardware sales, and consulting revenue. Number 2, don't pack in proof of concept or pilot revenue. Remember, B2B SaaS ARR signals a converted longer-term contract or agreement. Businesses which are in trial to purchase mode aren't actually yet customers under this definition. The hope is that your pilots convert to recurring contracted revenue, but there's still a chance they don't. So the risk profile of pilot or POC revenue is distinctly different from ARR, and it needs to be segmented as such. Your more accurate, more clearly characterized revenue statement now becomes $200K in ARR, $600K in implementation revenue, and $200K in pilot revenue. Number 3, don't pack in the total contract value of multi-year agreements into your current revenue. We'll often hear founders highlight they've signed a new marquee enterprise agreement and show that big TCV or total contract value like, look, our revenue is 1.5 million. Look at how well we've done. Here's the problem. If you fail to mention this figure represents the total revenue of a multi-year agreement, you're overselling when the investor is most interested in your ARR. And that's problematic because investors anchor to that bigger number as your annual contract potential, unless otherwise stated. So it ends up being a letdown when an investor finds out each customer is only worth, say, a third annually of what they first thought. This is easy to avoid, and the math is simple. A $750K 3-year contract gives you $250K in ARR you can confidently pitch to investors. You can't oversell multi-year TCV because technically it's not ARR, and investors will find out during diligence. Worse yet, if an investor detects you're being too shady around revenue, you very well may not even reach that diligence stage. Moving on. Number 4, distinguish revenue that's not tied to your core product, value prompts, or go-to-market customers. We've heard many founders sell us on great growth last year, only to then find out most of the revenue is not actually tied to the core product they're bringing to market. While investors commonly discount revenue like this, hiding it is a red flag. And since you've built up investor expectations, again, it's actually a letdown. When assessing risk during this part of the pitch, investors are keeping two stories in mind. The story of what your product is, vision, who you sell to, and its potential, against the story of your proof, traction, and signs your bet is correct. The mistake these founders make is misaligning these two stories. When both don't match up, you're not helping investors cleanly assess, and pitches like that are often riddled with confusion. For example, if you quickly spun up a new product during COVID, but it's not concretely related to what your startup set out to do, then call a spade and say, well, we did 1 million in revenue last year, but 800K of that was for a side product line that's not our core offering, but we adapted and we needed cash flow. You'll get more points for being transparent rather than trying to sell this as repeatable, de-risked, quality core product revenue. So don't put yourself in that bucket of pitches, and instead call out any revenue not tied to your core product, value props, or go-to-market customers. Number 5, clearly define the assumptions baked into signed contracts. You'd be surprised how many red flags pop up when startups present the nature of how they realize revenue from their current deployments. Some founders skew their ramp-up timeline and oversell a commercial agreement's likelihood or timing to scale. It starts sounding like broad enterprise buy-in, but turns out to just be the first stage of a phased launch contingent on success milestones. Like the land and expand strategy, but that important expand piece hasn't really taken place yet. And during QA, when investors try to assess that realization risk, they can't get a clear picture. It comes out muddled with variables that confound attribution, rollout startups aren't in control of, or a murky picture of how users within the enterprise will be reached, activated, and retained after the contract is signed. In any case, you want to clearly characterize your deployments, bringing to light any proof points needed to convert and get to the next revenue milestone. That's it. That's how to effectively give investors your B2B SaaS revenue breakdown and avoid easily fixable mistakes founders make when pitching. To present a more clear picture of your ARR, first, don't pack in one-off revenue tied to implementation, hardware sales, or consulting. An enterprise software investor is less concerned with revenue like this. True ARR is what really gets the blood pumping. Number 2, don't pack in proof of concept or pilot revenue, because businesses which are in trial to purchase mode aren't actually yet customers and don't count as ARR to investors. Number 3, don't pack in total contract value of multi-year agreements into your current revenue. If you're signing multi-year contracts, annualize the TCV, which is really your current revenue. Number 4, distinguish revenue that's not tied to your core product, value props, or go-to-market customers. Make sure your story aligns and point out any revenue that deviates from the narrative. Number 5, clearly define the assumptions baked into your signed contracts. You need to be on the same page with investors when it comes to quality factors like deployment stage, success milestones, and willingness to pay. Nothing is implied. Following these tips, you'll look much more sophisticated and mature if you layer in what investors are looking for. We're just scratching the surface here on revenue quality and how best to present enterprise SaaS revenue. So check out the related dose on traction from our very own Steve Barsh and 2 articles I threw in the description below from Benchmark's Bill Gurley and USV's Fred Wilson. I'm Elliot Levy, here with your Dreamit Dose. We'll see you next time. That pitch is so annoying. It's like, wait, I thought you're tracking respiratory conditions. Now you're telling me you're selling to schools? To present a more clear picture of your ARR, first, it's too slow. If an investor detects you're being too shady around revenue, damn it.